It is rare to find a physicist who is deeply religious. It is essentially unheard of to capture a candid conversation between two of us. Dr. Beryl Epstein and I both grew up with minimal Jewish observance, but we found that the rigorous logic of physics did not push us away from God. It actually brought us closer. In this unique interview, we discuss how to approach rational thinkers who lack religious conviction, while also delving into some of the deepest and most fascinating parallels of modern physics and fundamental Judaism. My goal with this channel is to help logical thinkers build unshakable conviction. So, if you know someone, a family member, a distant relative, or a close friend who is struggling to reconcile their faith with the modern world, please share this special video with them. It might just give them the new reference frame that they could benefit from. I'm very excited that we have here today Dr. Beryl Zachary Epstein, who is a senior staff scientist at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. That is a mouthful. And he's the author of Emuna and Physics, which is this book I have. And this is how I reached out to Dr. Epstein when I was looking at the idea, and I still am, God willing, putting together my own book based on my videos of my weekly Devar Torahs. And I was like, okay, is there anything out there in Torah and science, physics? And that's how I found Dr. Epstein. And I found him very engaged in the Reddit forum, which a lot of authors don't really spend time to do that. And he had his email address, and I reached out to him, and we've been going back and forth. And Baruch Hashem, what's interesting about us is that we have some similarities in how we became religious and around a similar time frame, and both of us going through as undergrads in physics and then eventually into graduate school and getting our PhDs and shifting slightly from there, but still both very involved and engaged and interested in the overlap between Torah and science and helping other Yidden come back in whatever challenges that they have. So I'm old school. I'm printed out notes to make it real. I want to structure this interview around the principles in a video I sent you before that I put out recently called How I Answer Uncomfortable Challenges of Religion. And in the reason, the motivating factor is to help logical thinkers build unshakable conviction by revealing the unity between modern science and ancient wisdom. In this case, Judaism. I put it there more broadly just because YouTube's a more broad audience. But people who are religious or spiritual, I have a bunch of non-Jews who follow me and comment, and I welcome everyone. So with that, the three main principles I put in that video were foundation, reframe, and reveal. And I want to go into those with you because I actually think that encapsulates a lot about your book and the work that you did. But before we do it, I think one of the things I talked about in there is that it's important to know who you're talking to, where the information is coming from. It's not like a physics textbook where, okay, here's the information, here's the equation. It doesn't really matter who made it up. But in this realm, I feel it is more important. So I just want to hear and tell the audience a little about yourself. You have an interesting story. So let's hear a little preview if you want. You were an undergrad or how you grew up, and then eventually you made your way. I think Chabad reached out to you. And you went to study, and I'll let you take it from here.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on, Yosef, and Dr. Wolf. It's great.
We can go to first name basis for now. Now that if someone's already listening this far in, then we can go Beryl and Yosef.
Okay, great. So thank God I grew up with a wonderful family, and I lived in Buffalo Grove, Illinois, the Chicago area, Stevenson High School. And I went to Duke University for undergraduate. I wanted to become a physicist and a string theorist at the time. I thought it would be pretty cool. Tried to figure out what sort of physics to go into. And there was a Chabad at UNC, wonderful Chabad, Rabbi Zalman Blooming. And now there's also a Chabad at Duke, which is also excellent, Nosson Falik. And I was interested in Yiddishkeit, like intellectually I was interested, but I didn't put a lot of time into learning about it as much until kind of the end of undergraduate. I thought, I should figure out like, what's this thing, Judaism? How do I live as a Jewish man? Like, what's really the right way to do things? So I went to spend 6 weeks in Mayanot thinking that like I was going to learn everything I needed to know about Judaism. And then I found out there's a lot more than I thought there is. And just thought it was an incredible experience. There's a lot of growth that happened there. And Reb Mordechai Guth, for example, at my just an incredible, inspiring force. And when I started grad school at University of Maryland for my PhD, I started keeping out all the mitzvos, and I started doing a lot of learning for all of graduate school. Spent some time in Eretz Yisrael after in Yeshiva, and kind of part-time after in Yeshiva. And thank God, it's been a wonderful journey, and I'm very fortunate to be part of Klal Yisrael. And yeah, every day is really a bracha.
Fantastic. But was there something that caused you to want to put you over the edge, or you finally got brainwashed? There must have been some sort of argument that did it for you.
Yeah, to me, it was like it was realizing the connection between Yiddishkeit today and Torah Sheba'al Peh and the original source. At the time, I was interested in observing because I understood the intellectually, I felt that it was the right thing. But as far as the finding that connection that a person has to keep Shabbos and has to keep kashrus and all of those levels, to me, seeing the connection between Torah Shebechsav and Torah Sheba'al Peh, and seeing the procession of how we get from point A to point B, that really for me, seeing that natural connection and the rigor that goes into those intellectual discussions, that really was inspiring for me.
Were you worried at all that people might judge you or it might hurt your career? I remember the first time I put on a kippah and walked to the office in grad school, I was sweating so much. I had I had my knitted red and black kippah because I was so into Rutgers, my undergrad, and I was at UC Irvine for graduate school. And I used to walk every day. It was beautiful weather, Southern California, and I was so sweaty. And I had my tzitzis on and I had shorts. Did I ever have tzitzis at that point? I don't remember actually. I think it was before tzitzis. And t-shirt, shorts, I should be fine. And I'm just schwitzing, like so worried that I'm going to be judged. And like, what's this crazy? So did you find any of that? Did you worry about that? Did you encounter anything like that?
It was a little nerve-wracking. Yeah. I remember like, should I wear the yarmulke? Should I not? Going different places and like trying things out, kind of getting used to it. I remember once I walked on like fraternity row at University of Maryland with, yarmulke and tzitzis just to fuse my two lives. But thank God, everyone's always more accepting than, and often, in a way where people are excited about it, that I find is, sometimes you think people are going to like judge you. But often just when people live according to their principles, I think the whole world respects that. And that's really something that I think is a powerful message for Klal Yisrael as a whole.
I was once after I got my PhD and then I went to Israel one-way ticket. So my advisor, that was in summer 2011. And then in December 2011, he was coming in for a conference with someone he worked with who was having one of these like 60 or 65-year-old birthdays, and they become like their own little you know what I mean? These like symposiums. So to celebrate the guy, but everyone's giving a talk, etc. So I had actually spoken at his group before I became religious, and then afterwards I tried to shake his hand and refused multiple times. The Israelis are the hardest usually, and he refused, and I was like, I wouldn't stop. Like I stayed there. I'm like, I'm trying to shake your hand. I'm like, what is that? And that was like the only time I realized, like, I was getting this. Like, what is this? So I was in, and I went to hide myself originally, so my advisor wouldn't see me. So I had a windbreaker and I had a hat, and someone came to me with my beard. Excuse me, are you lost? It was in Yerushalayim. I forgot if I mentioned that. And I was like, no, that's my advisor. And he's like, okay, fine. We spoke afterwards, and he said the field is getting really difficult. They put out, someone had just left to go into quantitative finance, and they had an open application for a tenure track professor, and said, we got 100 applicants and I have 12 amazing people, all would love to hire. They're incredible. And he's like, it's so difficult. So after that conversation, I was sitting at a table, and maybe she was like 30 years old and she was religious, Hebrew U. And there's two guys at our table, Israelis, not religious. We were talking, and I was in Yeshiva. So I brought up Har Sinai, and they said, you don't really think Moses came down from Mount Sinai? And they asked her, and she looks and she goes like this. Yeah. And I was like, of course, what do you mean? The Torah is true. Of course, we have a whole tradition. It goes all the way back, and Moshe Rabbeinu, and God gave the et cetera, the whole story. Like, but it's just the story. So that conviction, she was missing the conviction. She was afraid that, I guess maybe in Israel it's more difficult. And there was another guy named Gary Mammon, who has a tradition, he's from Maimonides. And he really liked me. And he said, when you're done with the whole yeshiva, come join me in France. And he's a very nice guy, very hospitable. And I got the food poisoning, and he took care of me and the whole thing. Okay, before we get there, so you do optics, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Optics is the only area of physics I have trauma from. Even though I'm the optics professor, it's junior year, I somehow came up with an A. When we were 16 in the class, it was a junior optics, and on my birthday, we only had one test, one midterm, and one final, and homework. So homework's really hard. But the grading went from like 10 to 15 out of 15. So 10 and 14 meant two very different things. And I remember he put the grades on the board without names, and I got a 73. I was the fourth lowest. I was devastated. I turned it around and I started like going to his office, always help with homework, et cetera, et cetera. We all asked him for a review. He gave us a 2-hour review and then didn't put a single question from the review on the final. And I somehow guessed something, and he had like a whole page. I did like 2 lines, and there's no way someone who was getting an A, like she left and she was all upset, and she ended up getting like a B plus, and I got an A, and I don't know how. And I guessed something. There's so many variables. It was like the luckiest guess ever. So optics, that was it. Like, I'm done with optics, no more, thank you. And I never went to speak to him for the last year and a half. Then he retired because I was afraid he made a mistake and he would go change my A to like a B or something. I don't know how I got an A, because he gave us the solutions right after, and we're all even more devastated when we actually saw how to do the problems. I got the right answer, and he had a whole page of work, and he's like, "There's no way I could have cheated, because there's no way any of us got that." So mamish, it was really lucky. And I have a question for you about optics. The principle of least time, Fermat's principle. I'm curious about that, because, and if you just explain briefly to people what it is, and it seems to me like there's some sort of hidden hand there. Maybe I'm wrong, but tell me, because I found it fascinating in the past. I never really delved into it, but because I was looking back up your title and the area you work in, I'm curious. Fermat's principle. Tell us what it is, and if you think it's actually alluding to something deeper, what's going on, or if I'm just like totally bonkers on this.
No, it's a very interesting question. I like that. So Fermat's principle for the audience is a concept when you're looking at what direction light is going to travel as it goes through different media meaning the plural of medium, meaning a material. So if you want to know what the light's going to do, so you can actually estimate the path that it's going to travel by saying, well, I want to start at this point, and the light's going to end up at this point. And so what's the shortest path that this light can take, meaning the shortest amount of time it'll take for the light to get there. And it's because light, when it travels through a material, it slows down. And when, as light's going through, you'll refract, and the light changes direction. And it happens to be that every path that
what
light
you're saying
ever
is that
takes,
if light goes from one material to another material, it might be going like this, and then it will change its angle to go like this because of the properties and or density of this difference between the first material and the second. So it's going to adjust its path, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And the path that it takes is always going to be a path that minimizes the amount of time. So whatever point it ends up at, based on whatever point it started at, it's always, if you look at all of the different paths, it's going to take the one that's the shortest path. Light always takes that shortest path. And it's quite interesting because there's a lot of different formulations that you can use to determine what light's going to do. You can look at the frequency and the wavelength, and you can ensure that there's no energy buildup on the edge of the substance, and that's one way to determine what light's going to do. And there's all these different mathematical formulations with different implications as far as what's really happening. But the MS is that all we know is that light follows that path. And that's what the science shows. And often we like to suggest that science is going to push outside of its realm. Sometimes people think science is going to prove or disprove religion, but really it gives different implications, and how we interpret those implications is based on our das, and our understanding. And what's very interesting is that sometimes what you might think physics implies, if you look at a different implication of a different formulation, so it might mean something quite different. And so they used to think, the world was eternal, there is no beginning. And you get certain properties in the universe, and you use the fact that the universe is consistent to get a lot of different properties in the universe, and different things that we observe. But it's just not true that the universe didn't come from something. And science has come around to that understanding. So sometimes the formulation can steer you wrong, but really the truth is just what the physics does. And secondly, the truth is the spiritual reality of it. So Fermat's principle, if light is going to travel along the fastest path, so what do you learn from it? One implication, perhaps, if a person wanted to look at Ruchnius and to say, what does this mean? So perhaps the light is used for the Torah or HaTorah. And so when Hashem wants to grant people light, to give people chokhmah and understanding, so Hashem's going to send it right at them. And it'll be, sometimes we think it's really the best, most direct route for us. Sometimes we think, well, it's kind of weird, like it was going there, then it went there, and we don't quite understand how
like
we got to that. Yeah, exactly. We don't quite understand how it got there, but if you look at the whole picture and you understand what medium and what material and what, scenario, ultimately it really is the fastest path, even though it looks like it kind of, the light went like that, but it curved like that. So that's one implication.
But is there, from a science perspective, for a physics perspective, or like a reason known why, or is it kind of a mystery? Like, for example, electrons inside of a circuit,
Sure, sure.
the theory is that the first electrons just kind of go wherever, and then let's say you have two paths, right? There's a junction, and you have one who has more resistance than the other, and they have to meet back up at the battery. So there'll be more of a backup, like cars being
Mhm.
backed up, like one lane versus two lanes, and then just like cars will naturally start to go to where there's a better flow. Is there something like that where the light initially, the photons, and somehow they're hitting into each other, even though photons don't really do that? Because photons are a particle wave duality, it's weird. So, I mean, electrons
Hmm.
are too, but is there, like, from a physics perspective, or is it just one of those mysteries?
There also is the Huygens-Fresnel principle. You can imagine that as light's traveling, suppose you have a plane of light that's traveling, plane, a plane that's traveling, and at each point you can imagine it as like a point particle that's releasing light. So you think like, at every point along your plane, it's like spheres that are expanding at the speed of light. And in the medium, it expands at a slower rate, because again, light travels more slowly in the medium. So if you would add together all of these different points, integrate over all of them, and you look at the interference between these different waves, so that's also going to show you that the path that's followed. And it's just a different formulation. And yet we see in the properties of light, we see that something is a plane, like it's infinite in extent, and at the same time, it's really just an infinitesimal point. And we see sort of the godless of Hashem in the fact that Hashem is great and the godless in the vast universe with all the galaxies and everything, the tremendous amount of matter in the universe. And at the same time, we see that Hashem's involved in even the smallest things and even the daily life of a person. And even in microscopic properties and a lot of physical things, sometimes you see the grand scales at the same time. The connection between quantum mechanics and even quantum gravity and how that relates at these tiny levels to what's going on the grand scale. We see this kind of beautiful resonance and unity.
Beautiful. It also reminds me of a little bit of entropy in some ways, that if it didn't take the path of least resistance, that you would then have a new question as to why it's going there. I actually have colored, I know, I can't believe it, but these little colored ones, little book, whatever they're called. Usually I'm not the type of guy. And I want to ask you a few questions here. If you're talking to someone who is open-minded, imagine like a teenager, 16, 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 20-year-old, something like that, or a young adult who is genuinely interested, doesn't have baggage, trauma, they just really don't know. And you only have a few minutes with them, a minute, let's say. You're standing in line with them somewhere, the library or a restaurant, I don't know, wherever. And they're like, hey, I notice you have, you have your kippah and you have your beer, like you're Jewish, Physicists. Like, why is it true? I've always wondered, like, why is it just a belief, or is there something deeper there? You have a minute with the guy. What do you say to them?
Oh, it
Like,
would
like
be
you have 30 seconds, 1 minute. He's a thinker, he's a logical thinker. He wants to know. He's not looking to argue. He just doesn't know. And he just, something pops in his mind, he wants to know. Like, what's your elevator pitch for why Judaism's true?
So I might ask him, why should the world exist? Is there anything? It's one, just to get the individual thinking a little bit, and maybe could share the concept of fine tuning of the universe, where the principles are so finely tuned. I guess Steven Weinberg had pointed out once, the late physicist, that even the decay rate of beryllium, I have a special connection with this atom, and I think
Oh,
183
this
decimal
barrel.
points, he said. Yeah, he said that you need that many decimal points, and if you're not within that precise tuning, you're not going to get heavy elements, and presumably you're not going to get life. And there's all these fine-tuned properties of the universe. I've seen lists of 20, lists of 70 and growing. If the properties of the universe were not so finely tuned to a degree where to get the right universe where you could have matter and have life, so you'd need like 10 to the 10 to the you know Penrose says 123, others say 17. There's different numbers, but either way, it's much larger than the number of particles in the universe. So in the whole universe, according to modern
Right.
estimates. So I might ask the individual, so which do you think is more likely? There's that many universes that we can't see, or that our universe just has an essential reality beneath it, which many have attested to throughout history, the existence of Hashem.
So then, very good. So then he would say, okay, I've heard the intelligent design argument. I can see that there's a God. Like I can fathom that. Like it seems possible or probable. But why Judaism? My mother's Jewish. I've been invited to these, a Hanukkah party or a Passover Seder, but this whole I have to wait in shul all day for Rosh Hashanah, they're blowing the shofar, Yom Kippur. I have to sit outside in the sukkah where it's nice, but here usually it's very schwitzy. What's with all these? Why Judaism? Why can't I just be a Buddhist or a Hindu or just be spiritual? There's a whole new spiritual movement. Like, why can't I just do that and believe in the loving kindness and okay, there's intelligent design, fine. But evolution, maybe. What? I'm not looking into why Judaism. I'm Jewish. Why should I keep mitzvahs?
One could say, well, there's more wisdom within Judaism than all of the other religions. You could say I've heard this from not only people who have joined Judaism, but even people who unfortunately left Judaism. So even they admit there's more depth, more wisdom within Judaism.
And I definitely saw that
and I
too.
could say, so let's study it. Oh, yeah.
No, but for me, that came after. Well, I heard Lawrence Kalaman talk about the Kuzari argument, right? And the Rebbe also speaks about that in letters. And it's not just them. The argument's been back that there's a Masorah, there's an unbroken tradition that goes all the way back. And that if you don't have, that's the argument I tend to use. I don't know if you use that with people, but that's the better. And YY Jacobson also says everything relies on that. So I don't know if you agree with that, but I ascribe to that the bedrock foundation for the validity of Judaism is the Masorah argument that God gave the Torah to Moshe at Har Sinai. There was 600,000 adult Jewish men, 7 million Jews, and there's an unbroken tradition that goes all the way back from then till now. And that once you've accepted that for me was my leap to start exploring it and saying, hey, actually, there is a lot of wisdom here. Actually, this is very interesting. Actually, the intelligent design is interesting. So I'm curious if that's a method that you use or what you think of that, or if you just naturally like to go towards the intelligent design and the Chachma route.
I do quite like the argument you mentioned. And I've seen precedents, of course, that the Rambam understands it to be such a yesod of our Emuna as Yidden, that this unbroken Masorah going back to Sinai. And I think it's a very powerful argument. I do like to bring it as well. I think it's something that shows the chiluk the difference between Judaism and other religions to a large degree. And usually my tendency is not to be toila everything on one argument or the other. I like to build, I'm sure
it depends on the
we
person.
only have a couple of minutes, of course.
Depends on the person.
Yeah, right.
So since your book is called Emuna and Physics, this is an area I think that intellectuals have trouble with, including myself at a deep level, which is this idea of Kabbalah's ol at a deep, deep level. And because we are intellectual and we want to figure things out, and we complicate things, whether justified or not. Sometimes it is justified. But, I think about someone like the Rebbe or think about other Talmidei Chachamim and how they're so intelligent and beyond intelligent, Ruach HaKodesh, etc. And yet when they asked the Rebbetzin about the Rebbe, Shem Abayis, of course, and what was the biggest trait or the most impressive trait about your husband? And she said his Emuna Peshuta, his simple faith. For someone that everyone who spoke to the Rebbe said he sounded like an expert, whether it was in military or engineering or medicine or politics or psychology, etc., or obviously in Torah, but I'm talking about from the secular field, who came in and talked to him. Like he's talking about the thicknesses of what type of armor in the Sinai desert when you're going after the Egyptians, because the bolts that they're using you have to add another 1/4 inch to the side. Like what he's, or he's talking about the side back streets in Yerushalayim and how to deal with a situation where they don't want the road open. And so if you change the one-way street this way to that way, the ambulances can still get by and you won't create a disagreement with this other community. And they're like, he knows the back streets of Jerusalem and he's never been there. So, and yet despite all that, it was Emuna Peshuta. So when I bring up the Masorah argument, in some ways the Masorah argument I don't think is Emuna, right? But then if you only have Emuna, so then what's the difference between Emuna or faith from the Jewish perspective versus the non-Jewish perspective? And how much does intellect come into that?
It's a very good question. I'm not an expert in all the religions to necessarily be able to say, but I can at least say as far as Yiddishkeit, for Judaism, I understand there's sort of two different paths. One is is internal and one is external. One is based on an understanding of feeling of the neshama and experience of Hashem in a person's life. And then there's the more external, looking at what we see on the ground and the evidence and how does the wisdom of Torah connect with things and the path of Jewish history and how miraculous it is. And I guess what you mentioned, the Kuzari principle and the revelation at Sinai, the Masorah, it fits into both a little bit because the Masorah is sort of internal. It is recognized that I asked my father who asked his father, and that sort of metzias could also be chale in that first sort of internal category, which is something very nice about it. And I suppose as far as different religions, so one thing that's nice is like when you talk about a unity of the universe and all the different places in the universe that we see that really it's what we see is oneness, and all of modern physics is kind of the theme. So Yiddishkeit is really the religion that came forth and said there's one God, ein od milvado, there's nothing else. And that sort of Chiddush, that sort of Judaism, I think uniquely lines up with the implications of modern physics.
So it's interesting you say that because here, the bookmarks, getting back to it, quantum entanglement. I'm curious your thoughts on this. You wrote, in order to describe an electron, it's only an approximation. To truly describe it, we must include in the calculation every single electron in the universe in a symmetrical way. That is, all electrons are one entity. And they're all intertwined despite being light years between them. Quantum entanglement experiments verify this, that measuring one particle will instantaneously affect another particle many, many miles away, even though things cannot, information at least, cannot travel this faster than the speed of light. And then you wrote, again, oneness. So if you want to expound just a little on that, quantum entanglement's a funny thing, but it's literally going off what you just said.
Sure. Yeah, so it's really an incredible phenomenon that we see that the electrons really do seem to be one entity. To change something that instantaneously, it's not that we saw information and the other electron actually knew it, but Bell's experiment really shows that the information mamish came from this electron here and faster than the speed of light transferred to the other one. And so the implication of these electrons really being one, and not only that, but quantum entanglement has been shown in the last 5 years between two different kinds of particles. So meaning we understand now the whole world is quantum entangled. Every particle is quantum entangled with every other particle. And to truly express the universe, you need sort of one wave function. And I think one thing we learn out of that, you're talking about to be mekabel ol malchus shamayim. So when we say Hashem is echad, so there's a lot of layers then in the Shema every morning and night when we say it. What does it mean Hashem is echad? So one is ein od milvado, the whole world is one. Not just there aren't other gods, but everything in the world is one. And furthermore, my ratzon and Hashem's ratzon are one. There's nothing except for Hashem. So the true resonance, proper existence is to put one's ratzon in line with that of Hashem, to be batel beshishi. And
I think that but in the entire being. But sorry, go on.
And the whole Metzias, right, even more. So that when we see milk dropping in a pot of chicken soup, it's just a mushal even for us when we try to drop in the pot of the whole Metzias of all of Hashem. And that one is, I think, what you talk about for, I think smart, rational people, I think like you and me, the concept of being mekabel ol malchuso. So when we grow up our whole lives, everyone, says you're so smart and you're doing great in school, and it creates a certain ego that makes it difficult sometimes, to be mekabel ol malchuso shemayim, because I'm something,
right.
I feel like
I'm important. I'm smart.
Other people can be easier, right? And so I think that's the beauty of like the Lubavitcher Rebbe when he has Emuna Peshuta, and you and I, who Baruch Hashem have arrived at the trajectory that we're in of getting closer and closer to the Ribono Shel Olam. It's really, I think part of that is that realization of how this oneness is not just a raya for Hashem. It's true, all the oneness in the universe, it shows that Yiddishkeit is front and center. What Abraham Avinu brought into the world of one God, that Metzias, it's showing that. But even within ourselves, I think that's the route towards growth and the route towards Hatzlacha.
Yes, and I was probably gonna mention in the intro how one of our roles, you and me and others as well, that you mentioned here, we're going to get to in a moment, in Mitzvah Hashem, is that people, I don't know about you, like when you're yourself, so, okay, what's so special? I did my PhD, I did my research, like it just makes sense to me, it works. Everyone's like, wow, you have a PhD, wow, in physics, et cetera, et cetera. And so they look at us with respect, with an aspect of kavod and with validity, and it helps build their conviction that they see that like we're fighting that battle, that they'll tell someone like, I don't really know, but I know that they do, and that he's written a book and he has a YouTube channel and this one has this and this has articles, and I've listened to them and I can't really reproduce all they're saying, I can show you them, but I know that they're out there and they're able to fight and they're holding strong. So that helps me have my conviction because I see them as pillars of truth and being able to fight these arguments and show the inner unity between everything. So I probably going to mention that in the intro that I'm going to do later, Mr. Shem. By the way, I didn't know that until I just read this because I haven't been kept up as much, that you can have quantum entanglement with other types of particles that are identical, which I think is fascinating. I want to look more into that.
Oh, cool.
Okay, I wanted to get it. I was going to skip CP violation unless we have time at the end. I don't think we will. Okay, this was very interesting. So you mentioned a number of physicists, and actually Alexander Poltorak, which I messaged you, I emailed him, emailed me back, very nice email. I forwarded it to you. I thought this was great. Here's one idea from Andy Goldfinger. Every electron, when we look on a very short time scale, is being recreated. Virtual particles and antiparticles seem to pop into existence and mediate this process. As an electron travels, for example, an electron and positron pop out of the vacuum. The original electron collides with the positron, and the new electron continues. Feynman diagrams depend on this. The particles that pop out of nothing are not just virtual. We observe their interaction with other particles. In Kabbalah, this is the concept of perpetual creation. As we reset every morning, in his goodness, meaning God, he renews daily and constantly the works of creation. Now, I found this very fascinating because this is a topic I love from Physicists, and even like I said, it's in the Siddur. There's a letter called the Tzchicha Bina, which is Epistle 11, or Siman Yud Aleph, and it's a Geras HaKodesh and the Alter Rebbe. And in there, he brings up this concept that Hashem's created in the world, Yesh Shamayim Kois V'Rega, something from nothing every moment. He also quotes a Shaykhad Emuna. But this, he says, whenever you're thinking there's something bad happening, realize that Hashem is creating the world every moment, something from nothing. And we see it not as exactly framed in the blessings of Shema, as you said, as you quoted there. It's very similar. The Alter Rebbe is a little more exact with it. I assume he's not the first one to put it up in the exact language. But I was always curious what the science, how it shows itself in science. And then that was the first time I saw it. And I recently also saw someone describe how if you have like the photoelectric effect where you have light or energy come in and hit or be absorbed into an electron in the lower orbital, and then it jumps to a higher orbital, it doesn't exist in between. It gets absorbed, somehow goes into the quantum vacuum or somehow there's some process, and then a new electron appears in the higher orbital, the quantum leap, if you will. And I never thought of that in terms of every particle in the universe being created something from nothing, and that you constantly have this quantum foam. So I don't know what thoughts you have on that. And I actually wanted to make a video at some point on that. And when I read it from yours, it was the first time I saw it. And I love when you see things and they just click. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, what you thought of when you first read it and how that affects you, or additional things I'm missing that I didn't bring up.
A fascinating thing that we see this parallel in modern physics and in Kabbalah. And Talmud Ma'aseh that the Talmud, you can touch it, as you said, as always, and the works of Hasidus that speak about this, that it's really a powerful life tool, being able to just not worry about anything. I remember like in my waking up one morning and it's just like the whole world is mamish new. There's nothing in my past, anything that any baggage weighing me down. Like there's nothing to every day. The person just mamish. We're there. We serve the Ribono Shel Olam. The world is just creative. There's nothing to worry about. It's something, very special implication. And also we see the time energy uncertainty principle is another place where this shows up, where anytime we measure the energy of a particle,
It's literally like the next paragraph.
Oh, right.
Literally, it's the next slide. Furthermore, there's a principle in physics called time, energy, uncertainty. All right, go on. No, it's great. Like you clearly wrote the book. You didn't have a ghostwriter. You can't be accused of ghostwriting these books. They're so niche. Anyway, sorry, go on. So the time uncertainty principle. Let's hear it.
So it's an incredible thing that if you run a energy experiment to measure the energy of something, so you run it over a short period of time, and that tells you how much variation there's going to be in the amount of energy that you measure. And so if you run an experiment for a long period of time and you keep measuring, the energy, so you'll get a very precise value of the energy. But it tells us that like, if it's anything like the position momentum uncertainty principle, Heisenberg uncertainty principle, where you can know the position, but not the momentum, or you can know the momentum, how fast it's traveling, but not the position. So it really, these things are not known, like they're fundamentally undefined in a way where over a very short time period, if you'll look at what's the energy variation, so it'll be so large that it's larger than the energy of the whole universe if you go on a short enough time period. So in a sense, over that time period, there is no energy existence according to this principle. You try to measure the energy of the whole universe if you had such a machine. I
Well,
guess
if
it'd
you
have to be
take the
outside
limit,
the
you get to
universe.
God. You get to Hashem.
I hear right. Very short period. I like infinite energy.
I just thought of that.
You see infinity. I like that.
The whole brainstorming. So you talk about the Higgs boson. Actually, that same conference I was at, the guy went up talked about they were finally found some of the Higgs. I'm going to put this, I guess, as its own thing. But you remember this? Can you explain this that you have here the carrier particles? Tell me what we're looking at here. We're looking at the Higgs boson and then the force carriers, and then we have different types of quarks and leptons here, and then that you connect it with the Israelite encampment. Can you explain all this? It's very interesting that you have the 12 and you have the symmetry, and I never really went so far into particle physics. So I'm more into astro realm, but it's always was interesting. I mean, you're into optics, but obviously this, so I'm curious, but you wrote it and researched it. So I'm just curious what these connections are.
Sure. So the concept itself is an idea from Dr. Alex Burke. And I was curious. I thought I was looking at the standard model and thinking, this is a very interesting, unique structure. There must be something in Torah that it lines up with. And so I looked, and sure enough, there is such a structure. And so I thought more about it and sort of came to an understanding that it's something very deep and very unexpected, that this parallel. And I do a little statistical calculation in the book where I say, what's the likelihood that anything is going to correspond to this structure that we have in the standard model? And it's trivial. Like the probability is so small. You could take every word in the whole Torah, and you're not going to find. You won't expect to find such a, or every. All the more so if you would take just every root, you don't expect to find such a structure being replicated. And the structure itself in particle physics. So it's on the outside is your 4 groups of 3, your 3 leptons, of which an electron is one of them, and your 3 lepton neutrinos. And then you have 3 quarks here and 3 quarks here. Different way you can divide it up, either by positive charge and negative charge. And so the structure is always the same, and it's Dafka. It's not just like they made it this way because it looks visually appealing. And it's pretty. This Particle Fever movie I reached out to, they put me in touch with the director of the whole movie who go ahead and use it. He was like, yeah, it's interesting between spirituality and particle physics. There's a lot of parallels. He was familiar a little. And so basically, why do we see this structure by the Machen?
You're talking about there's 1, 4, and then 12.
Correct, right. So on the outside, there's 4 sets of 3, and the 4 on the inside, but not the center one. The 4 on the inside, they mediate all the 4 forces of the universe, and gravity maybe is one of them. I have a question whether it should be 4 or 5 in the center there. So they mediate the interaction between all particles. So you have these matter particles, the quarks and the leptons, which all together form all your atoms and all the matter in the universe. And these particles, all the interactions between them using the electromagnetic force and the strong force, the weak force. So they just sort of, you could think of it as exchanging particles, but exchanging bosons between these particles, exchanging these force carrier particles. They're like malava. They like escort the particles and they escort them back. And that's how they communicate, and it brings particles
Which you said
together.
was Levi in the book.
Right. It's the same lashon, and all the different roles that these carrier particles play. It's very similar to the Levium in several ways in the Mikdash. And when I calculate the probability, I did very conservatively, only like the minimum, level of comparison. But there's a lot of parallels there. And what's interesting is the whole machane. The inside of this is the Higgs boson in your particle diagram, and that gives mass to everything.
And that's the God particle you quoted.
Right, they call it the God particle, and it mamish lines up where the schema.
And it's not the first time physicists use God. Like for the cosmic microwave background, it's the fingerprint of God. So they're not immune from that. But anyway, sorry, go on. So you have the Higgs boson in the middle, and just very briefly, for those that don't know what the Higgs boson is,
it gives mass to all particles, and it has a scalar property. Everything about it is 1. There's 1 particle that gives mass, and it in every direction it looks the same. It's like very unique in that way.
Because in the standard particle, right, there's this zoo of particles, and here you have oneness. Right, that's
and right in the middle of this diagram, and it giving mass to everything, the source of all mass. And here, so you have in the machane that travels. These are the 12 tribes in the groups of 3, and in the middle you have the Levium, and you have 4 or 5 groups also, depending on Moshe and Aaron, whether they're together one group. So then you'll have 4 or otherwise 5. And in the center of that is the Mishkan. And it's the dwelling place of Hashem, the God particle. It's supposed to be the particle, the place of fixation of where it dwells. And in the book, people can see the different parallels. And I think the essential one is like, if there's any particle, what's unique about the Machane is that the Torah goes to great lengths to say wherever Hashem said to go, the Machane went. Hashem said to stop, and it stopped, and they went for this many days, and they went for this many days. And it goes through a lot of great detail to explain how whatever Hashem did, the Machane Mamish did that. So if there's anything we need to learn that message about, if there's anything that we might think maybe it has a mind of its own, it'll do what it wants. So we think the particles of the universe, they're extremely lightweight and elusive, and they seem to fly wherever, all kinds of funky interactions, and who could even think what they're going to do? And there's infinite ones popping in and out of the vacuum, and this whole mess that's underlying all of matter. And we see wherever Hashem says to go, it goes. And Mamish does the Ratzon of Hashem. And not only that, but every single thing we see in the world, all matter is made up of these particles. And so what it says is not only these particles, but everything that's composed of them, the whole world just does what Hashem wants. Because if the particles within everything does what the Ribono Shel Olam says, so everything in the world is just following the direction of Hashem. And it's sort of a unique message that comes out of this.
So you just open up a can of worms for free will, but we're not going to go there for now. So a lot of your book, as I told you, and I encourage you, so I'll just say it here, I encourage you to write a second book, and I'm working on that. I actually found an easier way than what I told you before. And it's fact, because we were talking about the choice of the title, and I already went back and forth 10, 20 times with AI and my family and running back and forth. And it's for when making YouTube videos, I spend a lot of time thinking about titles and thumbnails. Don't always get it right, I hope, somewhat, but the audience is the one that decides. Even look at the top people like Mr. Beast. One video gets 100 million views, the other gets 400 million views. Like, it's the same team, it's the same thought process. They never know what exactly is going to kick off and resonate with someone. One of the things I found with your book, so this book seems to be written for, correct me if I'm wrong, it's really written for at least a lot of it is a reference. If someone is a thinker and wants to sit down and really darshan out and argue out and explore in detail, you're giving like 10, 15 bullet points of arguments and counter arguments like a lawyer versus someone who might want a little more light reading. And so my question is this, have you ever watched Apollo 13, the movie?
I have not.
You never did? So it's one of my favorite movies. And I watched it so much as a kid on VHS that I actually had most of it memorized. And that's what I used my time for. And there's a scene, you're familiar with Apollo 13, no? It almost blew up and there was a whole, if you're familiar. Okay, so in the movie, they're discussing, should they just stop and return and fire the rockets, get them home as quick as possible, or slingshot around the moon and come back? But it'll delay, and they're worried that other systems, they don't have enough oxygen and all this other stuff. The oxygen tanks were hit. So they said the LEM was never designed to have this many guys for this long. And then the one in charge goes, I don't care anything what was designed to do, I care what it can do.
I don't care what anything was designed to do. I care about what it can do. So let's get to work.
I say that because your book, I'm curious, who was it written for? I know you do mention in the beginning. Who have you found feedback? I know you told me that you got feedback that's been around the country and it's been advertised by Mosaic Press. I'll put a link below, of course, for those who want to purchase it. And the question is, who is it originally for? Who do you think has benefited the most from it now? Because generally it seems like those perhaps are not the ones shopping in Jewish bookstores. And if you were to make a second book, who would you direct it towards? And especially because you have this book to reference, and who would be your target audience? And what do you think your goal is to come out of the book?
Good question. So the main target audience I felt with the book was people who grew up religiously observant or have been religiously observant for quite a long time and have different questions, Emuna, questions of the Jewish faith, and especially those who have been in some of those like different atheist settings and groups where people try to argue against the Torah. And I find that the content is not actually challenging, but the environment itself, I think we really underestimate the effect of our environment. If we're around Yidden who are growing and stark, so it's very good. But if we allow ourselves to be part of society, which isn't trying to come close to Hashem, all the more so groups of atheists arguing against Yiddishkeit. So there's a lot of peer pressure, and it could be a very hard environment for people. So I wanted them to have a resource to be able to just intellectually, with rigor, analyze these different questions that sometimes people felt like they asked and no one really answered, or they didn't know where to go, or they didn't feel like they could ask. So just for people to be able to really explore a lot of these questions. And most of the all of the arguments against Judaism really rely upon false assumptions, certain assumptions that people make. But when you open up those assumptions, you see that within it, the question really doesn't stand. And similarly, you could take a proof for Judaism and ask questions on it. And then you're like, oh, it's solved it. I asked questions on it. But when you develop it, and I try to do that in the book a lot, to take a certain point of Emuna and to develop it and to ask questions and use that to open things up more. So in 99% of cases where I would do that, and I would run all the things by atheists and get their feedback, and like what you end up with at the end is actually, not only is it stronger than the initial way that it was put, but it echoes, they say like the end and the beginning are connected. The beginning is the end.
The end is wedged in the beginning, or the beginning is wedged in the end.
Right. And so you see that what comes out at the end most resembles the initial thought, most resembles the chokhmah that the person had. And so it's really I wrote it for people where they're not going to read something lightly and just take it as at face value. They're going to ask questions and analyze it and want to break it apart. And so it was for that kind of audience. But what it means is that the people who really like benefit from it, and feel, especially the ones who feel like connected to it, it's like those very intellectual people where they had like different questions and they felt like it helps them answer those questions. And also some people like who they see it at a shul, they open and they're like, yeah, smart physicist guy wrote stuff about Emuna. He knows all the questions. He believes it. This is great. And like sometimes people, none of us just need that to know that there's tons and tons of people who have looked at all the questions and they just didn't find them to be so compelling. And they felt that Judaism is really the most compelling thing to believe. And so it was more for that. But for a next book, I think if there's more discussions, I have one-on-one discussions with people. If more content comes out, I can make a similar book, or to do something like you suggested, something that's lighter that people are going to be able to just read lightly when they have 5 minutes here and there. And I think something like that could be a nice addition where it'll reference some of the deeper things. People know that they're not going to read it, then they'll walk away and have a question and they're like, oh, it doesn't make sense anymore. They'll know there's a place to look, but at the same time, they don't have to, like, it's hard to read, especially if you don't have a strong Jewish education or strong secular education. So it's challenging. It really deals with the issues.
Right, because you had sent me an email that you saw my video about the religious teen and you really enjoyed it. And that was sort of the reframe, which I sort of lost reference here of everything we're doing. But the reframe of like, I see where you're coming from and connecting with them. And ultimately, I think a lot of it is, even as us as intellectuals, and we think about things systematically, I think as we've gotten, I can speak for myself, that as I've gotten older, I care more about my Iker and Bapoyo and what the actual effect is on someone. And of course, I want things to be true and emes, but I feel like I'm less care about winning arguments, and time is much more of a commodity. So if I'm interacting with someone, like I have a few people write these long comments, and if 2 or 3 I've engaged back and forth, and it got very long and detailed, and I said, email me. We'll talk on Skype. Skype. We'll talk on WhatsApp, like whatever. They don't do it. And I'm like, I don't have to sit down and spend another half hour for every comment. You're not really responding to half the stuff I'm saying. And thank God we have 6 kids and a wife and everything else going on in my life. Like my time is limited, and I have to find what works. And even with this interview is, I want to spread out for people to be more engaged and to learn more about this and all that stuff we spoke about. That's why it's worth the time. So at some point I'm like, all right, do I spend all the time there, or do I help a few people actually get closer to Yiddishkeit and then eventually to bring Mashiach? And so that's my mentality going in there. The last question was, I just had it and it left because I'm getting old. Oh, the archaeology stuff. I did not get to it yet. I did not get to the archaeology stuff, but you did email me that you quoted certain pages about the Rebbe's approach. So I apologize I didn't get there yet, because like you said, it is not always the easiest read. And by the time I get to it, it's like 5 o'clock Shabbos and I'm starting to doze off, and it's not your fault. I could say whose fault it is, but they're at school. So Hashem. So can you just briefly talk about the archaeology as well, and what you meant by that, about the Rebbe's approach, and I guess even the age of, I don't know, I assume you're going to deal with the age of the universe there. I have my talk on that. It doesn't bother me as much, but I actually honestly haven't sat down and really dug into it. It's literally next to my spot on top of Silman's book and a few others. Whatever. Okay, so yeah, so please tell me, educate.
Sure.
Tell us, tell the audience.
So in general, I find that the different questions people have, either it's in philosophy, in archaeology, or in science, sometimes an overlap of the archaeology and the science. So for the book, I wanted to address the whole range of questions. And to do that, I had to learn quite a bit about archaeology beyond what I already knew, and interacting with some of the professionals in the field. And there's a review for someone who's like, why am I reading a physicist book about archaeology? So like there's a scum of sorts from an archaeologist. But so really a lot of these questions in archaeology,
Were
they're
these
different
Jewish
than science.
archaeologists? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Are these Jewish archaeologists you reach out to, or just any?
Many are, some not, different backgrounds, but biblical archaeology, it's the people who enter the field in general. People should know that it's largely predominantly secular people who enter the field of biblical archaeology, often secular Jews. And it's just not such an appealing field for like a From Yid. I spoke with a couple of the From Yid in there, and they were like, yeah, it's not like anyone goes into archaeology and stops being From or stops believing. It's just like who goes into a field that's so grayscale, where like that at the end you're going to say, well, like
It could be this, could be that.
it could be this. Yeah. So I looked into the methods of archaeology, and it's very different than physics. And it's like what I've always felt about like the biologists and the biology majors. Like they like go and then they learn like, yeah, the electron does this and it does that, and then you connect your molecules, and like they don't really know what's happening necessarily. There's certain like
He's a
rules they
simplified
found.
model. It's okay.
Yeah,
I had a grad
model,
student who
which
told
is-
me, he's like, this whole biophysics that was becoming popular 20 years ago, whatever, or forming, says once physicists get into a field, it starts to really strengthen it, put structure and quantitative reasoning, and that, like, can't just get away with this hand wavy stuff anymore. Like, there's a system. You have to go through the system and approach it. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it's the biologists.
Yeah.
We love biologists here, of course. We love everyone.
And what I found with like, I always felt a little like biology and archaeology is that you work with whatever assumptions there are, but the confidence in archaeology is like disgusting. It's like absurd. Like you see how people talk to each other in the field, and it's like they use like personal attacks, and they say things with complete confidence and then contradict themselves, and then come out to be wrong as archaeology discovers more from their like super confident statements. It's a different culture. And so people would throw around these arguments. They're like, this archaeologist said it with so much confidence. It must be Judaism's wrong. So I'm like, all right, so let's delve in and open it up, and let's see like what's really being said and what's known and what's not. And so I go through the different questions, and some of them are just like philosophical things. People didn't necessarily think of it in different ways. And so just being creative, understanding the breadth of what it can mean and what it really means. So I deal with a lot of the archaeology things. And sometimes people will like flex things to try to fit the science. And then the science just isn't being interpreted right, or it's just not right. And then time later, you discover something different. And so in the book, my general approach is to let the science be as right as we can, and let's assume it's right. And the regime post-Mabul Chabad will just assume science is either exactly the same or it's recovering from the Mabul. There's approaches in such a way as well. But as far as like the archaeology, I just say like, if archaeologists say anything contrary to the Torah, so we don't understand the archaeology, or we don't understand.
Well, you have a lot of pages of archaeology. Is there something you found in here that really made it like, hey, wow, that actually it does agree, or hey, wow, or on the opposite, hey, this finding everyone says is just completely without basis, really? Is there one specific example that we can hit off on?
Yeah, I think the great one is like the population of the Jews in the desert. And Joshua Berman, for example, sometimes if you're at the top of some kind of field and you say something, so everyone assumes everyone in that field feels that way. So like you have a rabbi archaeologist who says that the numbers in Chumash are not meant to be interpreted like exactly exaggerated. Yeah. And so people say, well, if he holds it, so then if even the rabbi holds. So I look into it and I go into depth into what's going on with the numbers. And it happens to be very nice that what I suspected to be the case. There's an archaeologist, Torah Ben Yosef in Eretz Yisrael, who at Tel Aviv University, who's been studying this and delving into it for now over a decade. And basically he says that both from the minimalists to the maximalists, they're all biased toward minimalism, because like archaeology is focused on preserved structures and what you see. But as many archaeologists have shown in recent years, there's a lot of things that don't leave structures behind. For example, if a place stays populated, as Yitzhak Meitless shows and cites a bunch of stuff, you're not going to see people lived over that area again. So they're using the things, or they're recycling the materials, or they're building over it. And you just don't see Yerushalayim for hundreds of years when it was populated. You don't see it in the archaeological record because they built over it and they use the resources. So a lot of these assumptions they found, Erez Ben Yosef found, like you have entire massive tribes of nomadic peoples, and like you're not going to see them. And not only that, but the Torah is mashma. If you look into the hanhaga of Hashem by the Yidden and what it means, like that we're an Ivri, we're the Ivriim, we pass by, like the way Hashem is manig, and you see hints of this throughout all of the Torah. that Hashem doesn't leave very much behind. He leaves a little bit of everything just so that we have what to build upon and what to understand and remember. And so the fact that certain things we don't see in the archaeology so clear, or certain things are unresolved, so often that itself fits very well in with what our expectations are. And not only according to the Torah, but also scientifically, what we expect to see from the past. It's not Pasha that we're going to see a lot of stuff. And what we see, it's not necessarily going to be the representative amount as opposed to just which region you happen to be able to see because it was well preserved.
They said that about the fossil record also, going all the way down. If you have anything you want to tell people or something to take away, we'd love to hear your parting words. Dr. Epstein.
I want the audience to know that lots of intelligent from people have looked at all the evidence in the science and the archaeology and all the different fields and come to the conclusion that Hashem is one and that the Ribono Shalom is in control of the whole world and that the Torah is true and that we should spend Yomam V'Laila studying Hashem's Torah. I think that's a beautiful thing. And we see it in the science. And Dr. Wolf's channel is an incredible place to learn about the wisdom of Torah and science and how they enhance one another and to increase in that and to be miskazik. And the purpose of the whole world is that we should be echad with Hashem. That throughout all modern physics, we see the oneness of Hashem, the Eino Milvado, and that the truth to true simcha, says Gran Mishle, that's how a person sameach b'chalko, when he takes his ratzon and he aligns it with the ratzon Hashem. And many people in life feel like sometimes something doesn't feel right in life. And in my experience, when something doesn't feel right in life, it's that the person has to shift into the lifestyle of learning and the Avodas Hashem, and that the more stark, often, if a person sort of feels like if a person's ever mevatel Torah, or a person doesn't feel good, and they might not know where that's coming from, but the more a person channels it, and the more a person strives to do the Ratzon Hashem, Hashem can open up things that you can never imagine, and different Kiddush Hashems, and that really is in the chassid. And even if it's not the most direct path how we see it, Hashem knows all the materials and knows all of reality, and he'll take the path of send things along the path
principle,
of least resistance.
The path of least resistance.
Right. As long as we're not taking the path of least resistance.
We have to do our job, and we have to let Hashem do his job. And we have to get out of the way. Okay, so thank you so much. It was a fascinating conversation, and I can't wait to see this edited and to send to you.